Hello, everybody. Welcome to our program. This is English Digest, and I'm Tom.
Hey, I'm Stephanie. How is everyone?
Yeah, how is everybody? I'm fine, and I hope you are too.
Yeah.
And today, of course, we're talking about transportation, how to get from point A to point B. And I suppose I should start this program off by asking you, Stephanie, how do you get to the office?
I usually take a cab here.
Okay.
If the bus is right there, I'll take it. Or if I have more time. Like today, I didn't get to eat lunch, so...
Okay.
Yeah,
But you took a taxi, which is in a car.
Oh, I wanted to mention, though, we don't just say taxi, guys. I know that's the only word we usually hear here, but a lot of people say cab, C-A-B, like I do.
You can do that too, a cab, a taxi, indeed. And taxis, of course, are cars. And other people get to work by driving. And so the car, of course, is the subject of today's lesson because so many people rely on the car for transportation. So we're going to talk about the history of the car. And we're going to talk about how the car made history. I guess people got around by different means in the past.
They sure did. There were a lot of horses that were being used, of course. This is our history unit, so we're going to go back in time for a while and learn more about some of the first cars, or what they called vehicles, that were invented long ago. They're kind of fun.
Can you envision a world without cars? It would be a very different place. The world we live in today was constructed with the automobile in mind, though it took some time to get there. It's only been in the past few centuries that we've started exploring the capabilities of motorized vehicles. There is no singular inventor of the automobile, making the history of the car somewhat complicated. Most historians credit Nicholas Joseph Cugnot's 1769 steam-powered tractor as the first vehicle in the lineage of the automobile. Scottish inventor Robert Anderson came up with an electric carriage in the 1830s, but limited battery technology of the time ensured it didn't make much of an impact. Gasoline-powered vehicles came next, thanks to Nicholas Otto and Eugen Langen, who built the first gas-powered engine in 1867. Siegfried Marcus was the first to utilize this engine, installing it in a vehicle around 1870. Then in 1886, Carl Benz patented the three-wheeled Benz patent Motorwagen. When production began on this vehicle in 1888, Benz gained the distinction of being the first person to commercially produce cars. Several gas-powered vehicles entered the market after this, but it was American inventor Henry Ford who really thrust the automobile onto the market. Ford standardized automobile production with a contemporary assembly line. By 1906, Ford was producing 100 cars a day, an incredible accomplishment for the time. When he introduced the moving assembly line in 1914, Ford was able to expand even further. This process made the vehicle much cheaper, allowing more people than ever to purchase one. By 1927, Ford had put more than 15 million cars on the road.
Well, it's our history unit, so we're going to talk about the history of the car, how the car made history. If you make history, you do something pretty darn important, and so people remember you or remember what you did, and they probably remember your name too. So, can you envision a world without cars? If you envision something, you use your imagination to think of something as a future possibility, or you could also use the synonym visualize. Can you visualize a world without cars? Hopefully, we don't have to go back in time and we don't lose our cars. But who knows? Things are getting kind of crazy. So can you envision yourself being really successful in life, I've heard, Tom, that it helps if you actually sit down and imagine yourself as a successful person, that it helps you achieve your goals. But you have to work hard, too.
They do say that. I think also they say that if you envision yourself being a good basketball player or something like that, then you will improve with your skills. But can you imagine, can you picture in your mind, can you envision a world without cars? It would be a very different place. It's fun to think about. How did people get around without cars? They had to ride horses, or they even had to walk or take boats down rivers and stuff like that. They certainly couldn't fly. And the world we live in today was constructed with the automobile in mind, though it took some time to get there. So yes, in the past we had cities and towns and places like that that weren't built to accommodate the automobile. They were designed with other means of transportation in mind, like the horse and carriage or walking and things like that. So when the car came along, things changed and we had to build highways and streets and various things. So it did take a while for cities to be more friendly for cars.
Yeah, and meanwhile, there was a period of time where there were cars and horses on the same street, and that got a little dangerous. You can imagine how dirty the streets used to be. We complain about how dirty cars make our planet. But those horses were pooping everywhere and it was just a mess. And so they were glad to get the cars because it was actually cleaner for the people back then. So moving on to paragraph 2, there is no singular inventor of the automobile, making the history of the car somewhat complicated. I know some people like to take credit for certain inventions. Depending on what country you're from, you might have heard that the TV was invented by one guy, whereas another country would say, no, no, no. Our citizen, our person over here invented it. Well, actually, the car went through a series of inventions and inventors. So when you say there is no singular inventor, you're saying there's no single one or no single person that is credited with inventing the automobile. So singular. We use singular a lot in grammar. I'm sure it's a word you hate to hear. Singular, of course, is 单数. So, but singular here just means one single thing, one only.
Exactly. So there's no one person who invented the car, basically, and that makes the history of the car kind of complicated or somewhat complicated to a large extent. If something's complicated, it involves all sorts of things, and sometimes it's difficult to figure out. Like the engine in a car is quite complicated. It's got lots of different parts. It's got the carburetor, and it's got the pistons and the cylinders, and it's got the oil sump and various things like that. And all these things have to work together with all the cables and all the gears and things like that. So of course, an automobile engine is quite complicated, or situations can be quite complicated. Are you guys going out? Well, yeah, we're kind of boyfriend and girlfriend, but it's complicated because she's still seeing her old boyfriend, and I'm still seeing my old girlfriend, and then there's another girl involved. So yeah, it's kind of complicated. It's not easy to explain.
I learned something new when I opened this document today that we're teaching you. I learned that the guy that is credited or given credit for coming up with kind of the first vehicle in history, this guy was from long ago, 1769. This is before we even had steam-powered trains, which was amazing. So 1769, the credit, if you give someone credit, or you can actually use credit as a verb. We credit Michael Jackson as being the king of pop music, or we credit this guy, Nicolas Joseph Cugnot. He's French. He actually came up with the first steam-powered tractor. Kind of looks like a tractor. You can look online. There's some really great videos online. As the first vehicle in the lineage of the automobile. I read a little bit about him, and the reason he came up with this is that the French military needed a way to pull their cannons onto the field, to move those cannons for war. So he came up with this idea. It's really kind of a huge piece of equipment, but it's very ingenious, meaning it's very clever.
And it was steam-powered,
Yeah.
which means basically it was an external combustion engine, which is when you use coal to boil water, and then the steam from the water causes the vehicle to move. Of course, there are steam-powered locomotives in various places around the world. At least the old railways had steam-powered locomotives.
Yeah.
They don't really exist so much anymore. I think they still have one on Alishan that's steam-powered, but nowadays they're all diesel or electric or whatever. And, of course, this vehicle was needed to, as you say, pull those cannons onto the battlefield. And, of course, that was the first vehicle in the lineage of the automobile. So I guess people say, well, that's probably the first automobile, even though it didn't burn gasoline. It was using steam. But if we talk about the lineage of something, well, we're talking about the line of succession. One came after the other in a series of inventions. So that's what the lineage is, the descent from an ancestor to the present time.
Now, there was a Scottish inventor, his name was Robert Anderson, and he came up with an electric carriage in the 1830s. That carriage is the part where people could sit in it, and then usually the carriage was pulled by at least 2 horses, maybe 1, 2, sometimes 4, depending on how much money somebody had. So if you come up with an idea or a thought, or a new kind of device, you're coming up with it in your mind. You're thinking of it, you're imagining it, you're devising a new way to do something. So he came up with this electric carriage in the 1830s. But you can imagine they didn't have very strong battery technology back then, so it didn't really make much of an impact. But we're going to still give him some credit, right? So he was from Scotland, so he's Scottish. And I didn't know about him either, Tom, so this is a new name for me.
Yep, it's all about the history of the car and how the car made history. That's our lesson for today. And we've reached the midpoint in today's explanation, so we're going to take a break right now and listen to our Chinese teacher.
Hello everyone, 我是派老师。今天讲解的是6月份6月8号 Unit6 How the Cars Made History。我相信大部分的听众都有搭乘汽车的经验，不过大家搭乘的时候是否有种幸福的感受呢？其实相较于人类文明史，汽车发展不过是100多年的事。过去漫长的岁月中，多数人如果要远行，真的是要忍受舟车劳顿，而且这样的车没有冷气，没有音响，更没有导航。透过这个单元的学习，希望听众更了解汽车，往后搭车的时候能够感受到生活便利的小确幸。我们一起来看这一课的学习重点吧。请看到第一段的第3句 The world we live in today was constructed with the automobile in mind, though it took some time to get there. 这句话的意思是说，我们现在所在的世界，当初在建构的时候，规划者把汽车纳入了考量，虽然并非一开始就如此。老师请同学看到 with the automobile in mind, with something 或者 with someone in mind， 就是心里有想到某个人或某件事，把某个人或某件事放在心上。再来，请同学看到第4个句子 It's only been in the past few centuries that we've started exploring the capabilities of motorized vehicles. 这是分裂句型，或者有些书本会称之为强调句型。请同学呢特别把 it's 还有 that 标示出来，这就是我们强调的部分。要强调的是时间副词 in the past few centuries 这里，所以它就放在 it's 还有 that 中间。还没有强调之前，原本的句型是 We have started exploring the capabilities of motorized vehicles only in the past few centuries. 为了要强调 only in the past few centuries 这个部分，我们把它用这个句型带入，就是放在 it's 还有 that 的中间。接着请同学看到第2段的第1个句子 There's no singular inventor 这边，请同学特别注意到后面的 making， 请画起来。这个其实呢也是分词构句的做法，原本呢应该是 which makes the history of the car。 这里的 which 所代替的呢，就是前面的这个句子，表示汽车并没有特定一位发明人。这件事情让汽车的历史有点复杂。再来，请同学特别看到第二个句子 Most historians credit Nicholas Joseph Goldnaut's 1769 steam-powered tractor as the first vehicle in the lineage of the automobile. 请把 credit 还有 as 画起来，就是把谁认定为什么，而且呢，这个 credit 通常呢就是指好的事情。比方说 Steve Jobs was credited as the person behind the first iPhone. 大家都知道说，智慧型手机在苹果推出 iPhone 之后开始风行起来，所以我们说 Steve Jobs was credited as the person behind the first iPhone， 指的就是 iPhone 背后的推手，大家认定呢就是 Steve Jobs 贾伯斯。
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. It's our history unit. It's a 2-day unit. And today we're starting in on the history of the car. You know, some of us don't know much about where the car came from, who came up with the idea, how did it start out. Most things that have continued to evolve over time have quite a long history. And some of these men's names I really wasn't familiar with before now. So we started out with asking people if they could imagine or envision or visualize a world without cars. We really depend on our cars a lot, or at least motorized vehicles. Maybe you drive a truck, a scooter. Maybe you like to take the train. So where would our world be without cars? So there's no one single person who is credited or is responsible for inventing the automobile. So history is a little bit complicated when you look at least in terms of how the car made history. We've got a French guy in 1769, Cugnot. He invented a steam-powered tractor, and it is kind of big and bulky. If you go online, they've got replicas of them. And also, there's a museum in France that has the original invention, which I'm shocked they still have. But if you're interested in that, you can go take a look in France. But then we found out there was this guy in Scotland, Robert Anderson. He came up with an electric carriage, but back then, the battery technology wasn't very advanced, and so it didn't make much of an impact. It wouldn't go very far before it needed more battery power.
Okay, so let's move on now to the next paragraph. It says, gasoline-powered vehicles came next, thanks to Nicholas Otto and Eugen Langen, who built the first gas-powered engine in 1867. Now, nowadays, of course, cars mostly use gasoline. Some vehicles use diesel fuel, which is different, but gasoline is the primary fuel that is used by cars today. And in the United States, sometimes we just shorten that to gas. So you might hear people say, oh, I need to go get some gas at the gas station.
Right.
But in England, that would sound weird to them because to them, gas means 瓦斯, the stuff that comes in those containers and you use it to heat up water on your stove. That would be gas. So they say they're going to get some petrol, whereas in America, we say we're going to get some gas or gasoline. And indeed, these powered cars, these gasoline-powered cars, were next in the lineage of the automobile. And we've got two inventors, Nicholas Otto and Eugen Langen. I hope I said those names right. And they built the first gas-powered engine way back in 1867, just after the American Civil War. Now, let's talk about another person here, Siegfried Marcus. He was the first to utilize this engine, installing it in a vehicle around 1870. So these two guys invented the gas-powered engine, but then this other guy, Mr. Marcus, actually used that engine in a vehicle. And when you put something in a vehicle or in a chassis or in a framework, you install it there. Just like when you buy a new air conditioner, you have to have someone come over and install it for you. They put it in the wall and they hook it up and they make it work and stuff like that. So indeed, they basically connected the engine to a vehicle in the year 1870.
They sure did. So they installed it in that vehicle, and then in 1886, and you guys will recognize this man's last name, Carl Benz. The Benz car that you guys like. We call him Mercedes-Benz, mostly in America, but you can shorten it to a Benz. Carl Benz patented the three-wheeled Benz patent motor wagon, or it looks like motor wagon. Of course, they use the V sound for the W, motor wagon. If you patent something, you actually go to the government and say, hey, I came up with this idea. I'm the first one to have thought of it. I want to make it official so no one else has the right to sell or make this particular device or invention without giving me credit and paying me some money. So patent. Mostly Americans will say patent. You won't hear that patent because that's how we speak. So you can use it as a verb or a noun. Patent, you need to patent something, or I got it patented, which means you already have that authority from the government. You might find out when you go to get a patent on something new, though, that someone beat you to it. We don't always know what other people are inventing around the world.
Exactly. So this fella, Carl Benz, patented this three-wheeled Benz vehicle called the Patent Motorwagen. And when production began on this vehicle way back in 1888,
wow.
Benz gained the distinction of being the first person to commercially produce cars. So yes, he got his patents and then he began production. And then he got the honor or the distinction or the recognition of being the first person in the world to commercially produce cars. He wasn't just producing this car as an invention in the laboratory. He was actually producing them to sell and make a profit, and people were driving them and using them as transportation.
Okay, moving on to the final paragraph, it says several gas-powered vehicles entered the market after this, but it was American inventor Henry Ford, who Tom and I, of course, know a lot about because we're Americans. He really thrust the automobile onto the market. To thrust is a verb that means to push, usually in front of you, to push something forward. Here we're just using it to move something forward with a lot of power, and we're not using it literally. This is figuratively. He really moved or pushed forward the automobile onto the market. He was able to come up with a way to mass produce a lot of cars. Benz was the first one to commercially sell them, but Henry Ford was able to mass produce them because he came up with something called the assembly line that we find in factories. So Ford standardized automobile production with a contemporary assembly line. If you standardize something, you make standards, you produce standards that people have to adopt or conform to. There are sort of these properties that you have to meet. You know that we have standardized tests, which means the tests have to all follow the same rules and be the same level of difficulty, perhaps. So you want to standardize if you use it as in a verb form. Or maybe you have standards, you have principles that you feel like you should obey to have a better life. Standards. Standardize, again, is the verb.
Right, so of course, production of automobiles or cars can be done in various places because they all have the same standards,
right.
The same size screws and tools and stuff like that. They can be used in different places, so it was standardized. And of course, it was a contemporary assembly line. Contemporary just means modern, and assembly is the process of putting things together. Like sometimes, of course, if you buy something at a furniture store like IKEA,
I hate that.
Assembly is required. You'll have to put it together yourself, unless it's like a bucket or something where it's already one piece, so you don't have to worry about that. But yeah, if it's a bookshelf or a bed or something, yes, it will require assembly. And by 1906, Ford was producing 100 cars a day, an incredible accomplishment for the time. So, of course, lots of people were able to buy cars because Ford was producing so many of them.
And they became cheaper because there were more of them.
Exactly. So, of course, the more you produce, course, the cheaper they can be. And when he introduced the moving assembly line in 1914, Ford was able to expand even further. So the assembly line, I guess, before didn't move, and then when it moved, the workers could stay in one place, and then the vehicle would just go past them, and then they would work on the next car in the assembly line.
Yeah, the moving assembly line, just picture the luggage carousel at the airport. It keeps moving and you just stand there. That's what they were able to come with way back in 1914. This process made the vehicle much cheaper, as I mentioned, allowing more people than ever to purchase one. When things get cheaper, it means just average people can afford to buy them and not just the rich people. So by 1927, Ford had put more than 15 million cars on the road. As Tom mentioned at the beginning of the program, having a car means you have to have traffic lights, good roads. You have to make sure people know the rules to drive, so not as many people get into accidents. So it really helped modernize the world when we got hold of this car.
Indeed, and that's the first part of our lesson concerning the history of the automobile or the car. Join us next time when we continue to talk about how the car made history. But right now, we need to listen to our Chinese teacher before we say goodbye.
接着，请同学看到第3段的第2个句子。第2个句子逗点之后 ，installing it in a vehicle around 1870。好，就是在汽油动力的引擎发明之后。开始呢，有人把它安装在车辆上 ，install 就表示安装，安装在哪里 ？Installing it 所指的就是前面的 gas-powered engine， 安装在车辆当中。再来，请看到第3句的主要动词 patented。patent 当名词是专利的意思，而这里当作动词用，就表示为什么发明申请专利。为什么发明申请专利？再来，请看到第4个句子，从 Benz 后面开始看 ，Benz gained the distinction of being the first person to commercially produce cars。请同学特别注意，这个片语 gain the distinction 的意思是获得荣耀。这句话的意思是说，宾士是第一位将汽车商业化生产的人，他获得了这一份的荣耀，大家认定他就是第一位将汽车商业化生产的人。再来，请看到第4段的第1个句子 Several gas-powered vehicles entered the market after this, but it was American inventor Henry Ford who really thrust the automobile onto the market. 这个也一样呢，其实是强调的句型，为了让我们清清楚楚知道到底是谁让汽车进入大众市场的。这里所运用的就是强调句型，所强调的就是 American inventor Henry Ford， 美国发明家亨利·福特，就是他把汽车导入大众市场。好的，再来，请同学看到第4个句子 When he introduced the moving assembly line in 1914， 请同学注意，这里 introduce 不要翻译成介绍，而是呢我们说推出某项产品，或者呢引进某项做法，其实都可以用 introduce 这个动词。好，以上是我们对课文第1天所做的中文讲解。
Okay, we've come to the end of our program for today. Make sure you join us again next time when we continue to try to answer the question, hey, how did the car make history? Well, we're going to tell you how the car made history next time. Please join us then. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
And I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
See ya.